Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. Back in the kitchen tonight, my middle son stood there with his backpack still on, asking if I could spot him some money for a spring break cabin trip in the mountains with his friends. And I felt this sudden tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the actual cash. He's a senior now, a good kid by just about anyone's standard. But the way he breezed past his mom, barely looking up from his phone, talking about whiskey and bonfires and off-grid for a week. Dad, it'll be epic. Scraped across a nerve I didn't know was still exposed. His mother has been walking a thin line with her mental health lately, and a week of him just being present at home would mean more to her than any medicine on the planet. But he's 21 and wired for escape, not caretaking. I can't even blame him. At his age, I was the exact same, maybe worse. That's the part that stings most. When I look at him, I see this younger, dumber version of myself, and I remember very clearly what I chose when I had the same fork in the road. He left for the gym, music leaking out of his earbuds, and I found myself standing alone at the sink, hands on the counter, staring out the window at our quiet street and thinking about another road, another break from school, a long time ago in a different set of mountains. I went to Ohio State in the late 80s. Nothing fancy like some coastal school, but I took it seriously. My folks were factory people, and getting out was the whole point. I drank and partied like everyone else, but there was always this voice in my head counting the loans, counting the shifts my dad picked up, telling me to keep it together. By junior year, I'd carved out a life that felt solid. Decent grades, decent friends, and this girl I was crazy about named Caroline Harper. She was from a tiny town tucked into the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky, a place I'd never heard of and couldn't spell right the first time she told me. Caroline was all sharp cheekbones and wild hair, the kind of girl who drove too fast and took up too much space in every room in the best possible way, and every story she told about home involved some combination of cousins, hollers, and trouble. I'd grown up on flat land and straight roads, so the way she talked about her mountains made them sound like another planet. When spring break rolled around, most of my friends were heading south to beaches, but Caroline asked if I'd go home with her instead, meet her family, see what real hills look like, as she put it. I said yes before I even thought about it, partly because I wanted to impress her and partly because I was 20 and stupid and the world still felt like something you could just walk straight into. The drive down into the hills felt like entering a maze. The interstate gave way to two-lane roads that twisted along dark river valleys, then to narrower strips of cracked asphalt with names instead of numbers. Houses started clinging to the sides of slopes instead of sitting square on lots. Rusted trucks sank into yards like half-buried bones. When we finally pulled into her town near dusk, the mountains rose up on every side, blue-gray and close, like a hand cupped over the sky. Her family was exactly the kind of loud, opinionated Southern clan shed promised. Aunts who hugged too hard, uncles with tobacco in their cheeks, and questions about football, cousins spilling out of every doorway. They already knew more about me than I was comfortable with. Caroline had clearly talked. Still, they welcomed me in that effortless way that made me feel like I'd been coming there for years. Most of the visit was just that: porches, food, people, but Caroline had plans for us too. She kept talking about this one trail deep in the national forest, a couple of ridges over, a place her older brother had shown her when she was in high school. She said you could follow it along a creek, climb up through a narrow hollow, then cut over the ridge and come out above an overlook where, on a clear day, you could see all the way into West Virginia. She made it sound like some secret door to another world. On the third day, her mom dropped us at a small gravel lot at the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest just after lunch. It was early March, the kind of raw cold that sits in the mud and waits for you. But the sky was high and bright, and the bare trees made the ridges look honest. There was one faded information board, a couple of parked pickups, and a narrow dirt path disappearing into the woods. It all felt a little cinematic. Me and this girl in her home mountains with a whole afternoon to ourselves. The first bad sign came before we even stepped onto the trail. Someone had stretched bright orange plastic fencing across the entrance and tacked a metal sign to the post. Trail closed. Landslide hazard. Below that, in smaller letters, was a date from 3 weeks earlier. A second, safer loop trail branched off to the right, marked with a different color, and there were fresh boot prints in the mud there. Caroline stood in front of the closed sign, jaw tight. She said this ridge trail was the whole point, that the other path was a boring loop for tourists, that her brother always said the good stuff was up high where the map didn't bother to go. I suggested we just take the open trail, come back another time. All the things a rational person is supposed to say. But I was also 20 and infatuated and dangerously susceptible to the way she looked at me when she wanted something. She said she wasn't about to waste the only day we had up here because of a piece of plastic and a government sign, that the landslide warning was probably just an excuse to keep people off the good parts. She reminded me that her brother had used those same words right before Head cut through a different closed section with her a few summers back. Eventually, she just gave me this half smile and ducked under the sagging fencing, boots squelching in the mud, and I followed because that's what you do when you're young, and the person you're with seems more real than any rules written by strangers. For the first half hour or so, it was everything Shed promised. The trail followed an old logging road along a creek swollen from snowmelt. Water ran clear over rounded stones, and here and there little cascades dropped into shadowed pools the color of bottle glass. The woods were quiet in that late winter way. No leaves yet, just the ghost of last year's undergrowth and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The path narrowed as we turned into a side hollow, the walls rising on both sides, and for a while it felt like we were walking down the middle of a green cathedral stripped bare. We weren't drinking heavily, just passing a shared flask of cheap bourbon back and forth when we stopped to catch our breath. I remember feeling light, almost cocky, like it'd been granted temporary citizenship in this world that belonged to her. The first horror came suddenly, the way truly bad things often do. We were rounding a bend where the trail climbed along the left side of the hollow, the creek now down below to our right. When Caroline stopped so abruptly, I nearly walked into her. Her shoulders went rigid. She lifted one hand a few inches, like she was reaching for something that wasn't there, and whispered, not quite loud enough for me to hear. I stepped to the side to see around her, and for a second my brain refused to process what my eyes were taking in. About 10 feet ahead, right in the middle of the trail, was the body of a fox. At least, that's what I told myself it was. Focusing on the russet fur, the white chest, the black paws, its head was gone, not chewed off, not mauled the way you'd expect from another animal. The cut where its neck should have been was disturbingly clean, a smooth collar of exposed flesh and vertebrae, like someone had taken a razor-sharp blade and removed everything above it in one motion. The body had been laid out carefully, feet together, spine straight, as if posed. I remember, absurdly, noting that there weren't even many leaves stuck to the fur yet. There were no flies, no smell. Whatever had happened hadn't happened long ago. Caroline made this small, broken sound in her throat and pressed closer to the rock wall, eyes fixed anywhere but the thing on the ground. I did the stupid male thing and stepped closer, half convinced that if I looked hard enough, I'd see something that made it less awful. A trap, a trick, anything that would explain it away. There was nothing. No blood sprayed on the rocks, no obvious drag marks. Just that body, cleanly severed, laid in the path as if waiting to be found. I felt the first real tug of fear then. Not the movie kind that comes with a rush of excitement, but the cold, logistical kind. Whoever had done this was probably still nearby, because this thing was too fresh for them not to be. I told Caroline it had to be some twisted hunter, or a trapper, maybe some illegal fur operation, grasping at anything that kept us in rational territory. I put my arm around her and we edged around the fox, pressing ourselves against the damp rock to avoid stepping on it. I remember how small she felt tucked against me, all that bravado she wore like armor suddenly gone. We kept walking up the hollow. but the lightness was gone, replaced by this brittle awareness of every sound. The hollow grew narrower, the creek now more of a series of small falls dropping over rocks stained dark with moss. Every broken branch made us tense. Every echo sounded like a footstep that wasn't ours. I tried to talk, to make jokes about bad horror movies that start exactly like this, but my voice sounded wrong in my own ears. Too loud, too forced. And Caroline just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Maybe 20 minutes later came the second horror, the one that still slips into my dreams sometimes. The trail crossed the creek and climbed up the opposite side of the hollow, switchbacking through a stand of small pines that had somehow taken root on the steep slope. It was there we started seeing things carved into the trunks. At first it was just initials, JM plus LS, stuff like that. But then there were crude symbols I didn't recognize. Uneven circles with crosses slashed through them, jagged triangles stacked like teeth, a series of tally marks that wrapped around the bark as if someone had stood there for a long time, scoring line after line into living wood. Farther up, on a small plateau where the trail leveled out for a moment, we found what I can only describe as a makeshift camp. Someone had wedged a few dead branches between trees to form a low lean-to, barely enough to cover a grown man lying flat. Beneath it, the ground was matted down. On a nearby stump sat a rusted coffee can half full of cigarette butts and something darker that had dried in sticky streaks along the side. A coil of nylon rope lay beside it, stained at one end. The air under that thin roof smelled wrong, a sour mix of old smoke, sweat, and copper. Hanging from one of the branches overhead were 3 small shapes, swaying almost imperceptibly in the breeze. Tiny animal skulls, cleaned of flesh, threaded through the eye sockets with twine. Squirrel, maybe, or something like it. Not artful, not ritual, in any way I recognized. Just arranged. Caroline grabbed my wrist so hard her fingernails dug crescents into my skin and whispered that she wanted to go back. Now, that this wasn't just some hunter's camp, that we had no business being this far off the main trail to begin with. I didn't argue. Whatever leftover curiosity it had burned off, leaving only calculation. How long would it take us to get back to the car? How much daylight did we have? What would we do if we ran into whoever had been staying here? As we turned around, I made the mistake of looking back toward the lean-to one last time and caught sight of something half buried under a tarp at the rear of the shelter. Just a shape, really. Long and narrow, bound with more rope. The outline of what could have been a log or a duffel or something worse. There were damp patches seeped through the fabric in places that didn't match any benign explanation my brain tried to offer. I didn't tell Caroline about that. There was nothing helpful about sharing that image with her in that moment. It was enough for one of us to carry it. We started down the trail faster than was smart, slipping in spots where the mud was slick, hearts beating too loud. When we reached the stretch where the fox had been, I told Caroline to look at her feet and keep walking, that I'd tell her when we were past. I braced myself for it in a strange ritual way, counting my steps. 5, 10, 15. The place we'd pressed ourselves against the rock wall was unmistakable, the smear of mud from our jackets, the broken twig where Caroline's elbow had caught, but the animal was gone. The ground, where its body had lain, was a darker, damp patch, with a smear of fur and a couple of small, wet clumps of something I didn't want to analyze. But the fox itself was nowhere in sight. Instead, the third horror waited 10 yards downhill, where a low-hanging branch stretched out over the creek. Someone had tied the fox body by its hind legs to that branch so that it hung upside down over the water, swinging slightly. Its missing neck pointed toward the creek like some obscene arrow. A second rope had been looped around its midsection and threaded through what looked like a piece of rebar hammered into the bank, as if whoever had done this didn't want the body to spin too much. Beneath it, on a flat rock, lay the head. It had been placed there carefully, eyes half open, tongue lolling. The lower jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and there were fresh cuts along the muzzle as if someone had been experimenting. The blood that had seeped from those wounds trailed into the water in thin, pink streams. Caroline saw everything before I could stop her. The sound she made then was not a scream, exactly, but something smaller and rawer, like something inside her tearing loose. She doubled over, hands on her knees, and started to shake. Not the dramatic movie tremble, but quick, violent shivers like her body was trying to jump out of its own skin. I pulled her upright and told her we had to move, that whoever was doing this was close enough to have lifted and arranged that body in the time it had taken us to reach the camp and come back. We half ran, half slid down the trail, branches whipping our faces, adrenaline burning through the bourbon haze. At some point, high above us on the ridge, there was a sound that froze us both mid-stride. A scream, high and sustained, like a woman calling for help with everything she had left. It rose, broke, then cut off abruptly, swallowed by the folds of the hills. I felt my brain split in two. One part cataloged the facts, direction, distance, possibility of echo, and concluded that someone was up there and in trouble. The other part, the part that had just seen what Wed's seen, wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of those woods as fast as possible. Caroline's eyes met mine, wide and wet, and I could see the same war playing out behind them. In the end, fear won. We kept moving down, not talking, not stopping. My chest burned, my thighs ached, and every time the trail curved, I was sure Wed round the bend and come face to face with whoever had carved those symbols and strung up that fox and maybe wrapped something long and narrow in tarp and rope under a lean-to on a forgotten slope in the Daniel Boone National Forest. But we didn't see anyone. When the plastic fencing finally came into view through the trees, orange against the gray trunks, I nearly laughed from sheer relief. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took for me to realize there was a figure standing at the trailhead, arms crossed. A park ranger in a green jacket and hat, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. He started in on us the second we ducked under the barrier, demanding to know what part of closed we didn't understand, whether we had any idea how dangerous the terrain up there was. He looked ready to throw us out of the forest system for life, scratch our names into a blacklist. Then he really looked at Caroline, mud-streaked, breathing ragged, eyes red and hollowed out, and his tone shifted. I told him everything, because I didn't know what else to do with it. The fox, the camp, the skulls, the scream. I heard my own voice shaking as I laid out the details. Half afraid he'd think I was making it up, half afraid he'd tell me it was all normal, just hunters and kids and echo. Instead, his jaw tightened, and he told us to follow him to a small ranger station near the parking lot. There, his supervisor made me go through the whole thing again while Caroline sat on a bench, staring at her hands, occasionally flinching at noises outside. The supervisor called the county sheriff, and I told it all again to a deputy with a notebook, who asked careful questions about times and distances and whether he'd seen any vehicles at the trailhead when we arrived. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody laughed. They took it seriously in that quiet way that made me feel both relieved and more terrified, because it meant they didn't think this was just kids being dramatic. Caroline's mom arrived not long after and swept her into the kind of hug you usually only see in hospital waiting rooms. Then they were gone, and I was left standing in the doorway of that squat cinder block building, watching officers and rangers gear up, radios crackling. Heading up the trail, Wed just fled. I never heard what they found. A few weeks later, back on campus, Caroline and I tried to talk about it once over beers, but the conversation ran aground quickly on the things we didn't want to picture. By summer, Wed drifted apart the way college couples often do, and whatever news might have made it back to her family didn't make it to me. Life moved on. Classes and jobs and marriage and kids, and that day sank into the sediment of my memory, buried under years of more ordinary worries. Every now and then, though, something shakes it loose. A scream in a horror movie that hits the same pitch as the one that rolled down that ridge. The flash of an orange closed sign on a trailhead. A phone call from my wife's therapist about adjusting her meds, and there it is again. That long walk through a quiet Appalachian hollow where something ugly was living just out of sight. Tonight it was my son, asking for money to go vanish into some rental cabin deep in these same mountains with his friends and their bottles and their certainty that nothing truly bad can touch them. I want to say no just to keep him here, within reach, where the things that can hurt him are at least familiar. At the same time, I remember how small my world would have stayed if I'd never followed anyone under a sagging plastic fence. I don't tell him this story in full. Not yet. He wouldn't hear the parts I need him to hear. But I can feel it rising in me. The urge to warn him that the scariest things in any set of woods are not ghosts or monsters, but the people who go there to do what they don't want anyone else to see. And that sometimes trail closed isn't about the mud or the rocks, but about keeping you away from someone who doesn't care if you ever make it back to the parking lot. Maybe one day it'll sit him down and lay it all out. Until then, I carry it myself. And on nights like this, I find myself wondering who else has a story lying dormant like that, waiting for the right question or the right mistake to pull it to the surface again. If you've ever had a moment in the woods that still lives under your skin years later, I'd honestly like to hear it. Drop it in the comments, so I know we're not the only ones who walked out of something we were never meant to see. Story 2. I've always thought of myself as pretty laid back, the kind of person who assumes things will work out if you don't poke them too hard. And for most of my 20s, that attitude more or less kept me afloat. The trip I'm about to talk about cured me of that in one long, ugly night. It was last year, early spring, when the air in the foothills of the Appalachians is still cold enough to sting your lungs at night, but warm enough in the afternoon to make you think camping is a good idea. My friends and I had decided that instead of burning cash on some crowded beach, we'd head into the mountains for spring break, find a spot along the river, and just disappear for a couple of days. It was supposed to be me, my buddy Drew, and our friends Kayla and Morgan, 3 days in southeastern Kentucky, near a bend in the Cumberland River, where an old Forest Service road dead-ended at a sandy little bar people sometimes used as an informal campsite. I'd been there once before with my cousin, and I remembered the stars and the sound of the water more than anything else. No crowds, no traffic, just the river, the fire. And for me, my dog Ranger, a big, dark-coated German shepherd who loved the woods more than he loved anything. We rolled in later than we'd planned, light already getting thin between the ridges as my tires crunched over gravel and then soft dirt, the drop-off to the river visible through the trees. The place was as isolated as I remembered. No other cars, no sign of fishermen, nothing but the dull shimmer of the water down below and the last orange smear of sunset stuck to the tops of the mountains. As I eased into the little clearing at the end of the road, my headlights swept across something that made my shoulders tense without me fully understanding why. Off to the left of the spot where everyone usually pitched their tents was an older fire ring, half collapsed, with a blackened circle of stones and ash inside. That wasn't strange in itself. People had been coming out here for years. What was strange was what lay in the ashes. A melted sneaker sole with the fabric burned off, the twisted metal frame of what looked like a folding chair, and half buried in the soot, a length of silver duct tape with torn cloth still stuck to it. The tape had clearly been exposed to heat, the edges curled and blackened, but you could still see where it had been wrapped around something. Nearby, shoved between two rocks, was a broken plastic zip tie stained a rusty brown at one end. I didn't point it out to anyone, because that's what laid-back people do. We swallow the things that might ruin the mood. Ranger hopped out of the car as soon as I opened the door, nose working overtime, doing slow circuits around the clearing with more focus than usual. Drew and I started setting up the tents while the girls unpacked the food and dragged our camp chairs into a loose circle, laughing about how this beat a loud bar in Florida. Twilight fell fast in that hollow, the ridges pulling the light down early, and the forest went from gray to black in what felt like a few minutes. Kayla had just cracked her seltzer and was roasting a hot dog on a stick when she glanced up toward the forest road and said she thought she saw headlights between the trees. I turned, and sure enough, a pair of weak yellow beams was making its way slowly down the rutted track toward us, disappearing and reappearing as the vehicle dipped into potholes and climbed back out. It was an old SUV, maybe a Blazer or something like it, paint dulled, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other. It rolled past the point where most people parked, kept going like it was going to nose right into our camp, then braked, idled for a minute, and backed up in a slow, awkward turn before heading back up the road. It didn't stop long enough to be anything more than a nuisance, and we shrugged it off, chalking it up to someone who'd come down to see if the spot was free and kept going. Still, as it disappeared between the trees, I noticed the way Ranger was watching, ears forward, body stiff, a low vibration starting in his throat that never quite became a growl. We tried to shake off the tension by focusing on the fire, the drinks, the normal camp stuff. The sky went full black, and the stars came out in that crazy way they do when you're far from town. Wed just started to relax when the second creepy detail of the night made itself known. Drew went to take a leak in the woods just behind camp, and I saw his flashlight beam freeze on something, then jerk back like he didn't want to see it. He called me over, voice tighter than usual, so I grabbed my own light and followed. About 20 feet from the tents, tacked to a skinny oak tree with a rusted nail, was a piece of plywood about the size of a license plate. On it, in faded red paint, someone had written 3 words in uneven block letters: "No one stays." The surface of the wood was pitted and cracked, like it had been there a while, but beneath the paint were fresher gouges, deep lines carved into the grain that looked like someone had tried to scratch the message out with a knife and given up. For a moment, standing there with the cold mist from the river threading through the trees, I felt something like déjà vu, or maybe just good old-fashioned dread. It could have been a dumb prank, some local scaring off tourists, but paired with the burned shoe, the duct tape, and Ranger's restless pacing, it all felt like part of the same unpleasant story. I told myself we were being paranoid, that if something truly bad had happened here, the Forest Service would have closed the road, put up a gate, something official and undeniable. I suggested we move the tents a little closer to the car, just in case, which made everyone feel better without acknowledging why. We were sitting around the fire an hour later, telling stories and pretending everything felt normal, when Kayla pointed up the road again, her face going still. The same old SUV was crawling back toward us, this time with its headlights off, coasting down the ruts on what sounded like barely their engine power. The only reason we saw it at all was because the firelight reflected faintly off the windshield as it came around the last bend. As it drew closer, the lights flicked on and cut across our camp in a harsh, sudden glare that made all of us flinch. The truck rolled to a stop on the narrow track parallel with our sight, engine idling. None of us said anything for a second, waiting to see if it would keep going. But then the driver's door creaked open. A tall figure climbed out and shut the door with a heavy, deliberate thud. Even in the half-light, I could see that his movements were off. There was a hitch in his gait, a little stumble every third step, like his legs and his brain weren't quite on the same page. He started walking toward our camp, hands loose at his sides, and the girls went quiet. Drew and I stood up almost automatically, stepping forward a few paces to put ourselves between the stranger and our friends. Ranger, who had been lying by the fire, rose and moved with us, the fur along his spine lifting in a slow, bristling wave. Up close, the man smelled like old sweat and cheap liquor, and his eyes were too bright in a way I've come to hate. He said something about us being on his property, voice thick, consonants dragging. I knew enough about land in these parts to be pretty sure he was lying. We were inside national forest boundaries, and there hadn't been any no trespassing signs on the way in. My mouth went dry as I tried to respond in that careful, calm tone you use with someone unpredictable, saying we thought it was public land, that if it wasn't wed, pack up and head out. His expression didn't change. Instead of answering, he reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. It wasn't a pocket knife, either. It was a fixed-blade hunting knife with a dark handle and a long, narrow blade that caught the firelight. That's when something in Ranger snapped from wariness into action. The dog launched forward with a sound I had never heard from him before. A deep, full-body roar. The guy barely had time to bring his arm up before Ranger hit him, teeth clamping around the wrist that held the knife. They went down hard in the dirt, the knife skittering away toward the edge of the clearing. The man shouted in pain and rage, a ragged sound that seemed too loud for the quiet hollow, and for a split second it looked like he was going to get his other arm around Ranger's throat. My entire world narrowed to that tangle of limbs and fur and steel. I managed to shout Ranger's name and a command to release, heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. Somehow, miraculously, the dog listened. He let go and sprang backward, positioning himself between us and the man, barking now instead of biting. though his body language made it clear he'd go again if he had to. The stranger staggered to his feet, cradling his wrist. Even from where I stood, I could see the dark wetness on his sleeve, the way his fingers wouldn't quite close. His eyes darted from the knife on the ground back to Ranger, calculating odds. Then, without another word, he turned and ran toward his SUV, clutching his arm to his chest. The whole thing had taken maybe 20 seconds. As his taillights disappeared back up the road, we all exhaled at once like we'd been holding the same breath. That should have been the end of it. But fear has a way of finding new footholds once you open the door. Kayla wanted to leave immediately, throw everything in the car and bounce. But the idea of driving that sketchy road in the dark with a guy like that roaming around made my stomach twist. Morgan pointed out that out here, people don't always call the cops. And guys who feel disrespected in their own spot sometimes come back with bigger weapons. She wasn't being dramatic. She grew up in a nearby county and had more stories than she liked to tell. The compromise we landed on was calling the sheriff and having them meet us at the top of the forest road. While Morgan dialed, I walked the perimeter of the campsite with my flashlight, trying to keep my hands from shaking. That's when I found the third horror detail, one that made my skin crawl in a quieter but more lasting way. On the far edge of the clearing, beyond the glow of the fire, there was a small flat spot where the ground sloped gently toward the river. Our coolers had been sitting there earlier, stacked neatly. Now, one of them was open, the lid propped back. Inside, the ice had been disturbed, bags shoved around. The pack of hot dogs we hadn't opened yet was gone, as were 2 beers we'd left buried at the bottom. That would have been annoying but explainable. Raccoons, maybe, or some other scavenger, except for one detail. Lying on top of the ice, where I knew we hadn't left it, was a brand new, unused roll of bright orange paracord, the kind people use for tying down tarps or rigging shelters. None of us owned paracord that color. Ours was olive green, and it was still coiled in the back of my SUV. The roll in the cooler was wet and cold, like it had been placed there recently, and there were smudges of something dark on the plastic wrapper. I picked it up with 2 fingers and felt my throat tighten. It wasn't just that someone had been close enough to our camp to mess with our stuff without us noticing. It was the implication that they were bringing things to us, planting them where we'd find them later, maybe long after they were gone. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, a single cruiser nosing down the forest road with its light bar off relief washed over me so hard I felt lightheaded. We doused the fire, grabbed the essentials, and started hauling our gear toward the car, Ranger glued to my side, posture still taut. The deputy, a solid guy in his 50s with a lined face and a calm, practiced manner, stepped out and immediately looked us over, eyes flicking from the dog to the girls to the tree line. We told him what had happened, each filling in details the others forgot, and he listened with a seriousness that made the whole thing feel even more real. Then he walked around my SUV, shining his flashlight along the tires and underneath. I didn't know what he was looking for until he paused at the rear driver's side and crouched. He told me to come take a look. The tire was flat completely, silently dead. A thin, clean gash about 2 inches long ran across the sidewall, too neat to be a rock or a bad pothole. He checked the others and found the same thing. All 4 slashed, all 4 bleeding slow air into the gravel. My relief evaporated. The deputy straightened up slowly, then told me to unlock the vehicle. For a second I thought he was kidding, but his expression didn't change, so I did as he said. He opened the rear hatch first, shined his light inside, then leaned closer to peer into the dark corners around the gear we hadn't unloaded yet. That's when the final, quiet punch of the night landed. There, wedged behind my duffel bag and half hidden under a folded tarp that wasn't mine, was a heavy, mud-streaked hammer. Not a claw hammer from someone's toolbox. This one had a smooth, round head like the kind used in construction or sometimes in slaughterhouses. The handle was wrapped in dirty athletic tape. One end of the tarp had been pulled over it as if someone had stashed it in a hurry. My brain flashed back to the 15 minutes earlier in the evening when Drew and I had walked down to the riverbank to skip stones and let Ranger splash in the shallows while the girls stayed by the fire. 15 minutes where my car had been sitting unlocked, The back hatch closed, but not latched all the way because I'd told myself we were basically right there. The deputy picked up the hammer carefully with 2 gloved fingers, turned it under the light, then set it in an evidence bag he produced from his pocket like it was something he did more often than I wanted to think about. He didn't say much after that beyond the basics. They'd put out a bolo on the SUV, head call for a tow to help with the tires. He recommended we find a motel in town for the night instead of trying to camp again. He took our statements and our contact info, and in the weary way of small-town law enforcement, he promised to be in touch if they picked anyone up that fit the description. The rest of the night is a blur of logistics. The tow truck's headlights bouncing off the trees as it crawled down the road. The metallic smell of the evidence bag lying on the hood of the cruiser. Kayla quietly crying in the back seat as the adrenaline finally burned off. I remember lying in a cheap motel bed a few hours later, Ranger curled up on the floor within arm's reach, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and thinking about that painted sign on the oak tree. No one stays. At the time, it had sounded like a warning or a threat, something aimed at outsiders like us. Lying there in the dark, I realized it might also have been a fact, a sentence left behind by someone who had seen this pattern play out before. You come to the river to get away from everything, to be alone with your friends and your music and your firelight, and you forget that sometimes the most dangerous thing about being alone is that the wrong person might decide to share that isolation with you on their terms. These days, when people talk about heading into the mountains to unplug or find some secluded spot by a river or a lake, I bite back the urge to dump this whole story on them like a verbal warning label. I still camp. I still love the dark and the sound of water, and the way a fire makes everyone look softer and more honest. But I park with my vehicle pointed out, I keep my keys in my pocket, and I watch the road in a way I didn't before. And I always bring Ranger. I'm curious if anyone else has had a night like that where the scariest thing wasn't a bear or getting lost, but another human being who decided your little patch of nowhere was theirs to play with. If you've got a story like that tucked away, I'd honestly like to hear it. So drop it in the comments and make me feel a little less alone about triple-checking the locks every time I'm off the grid. Story 3. My name is Lauren, and for most of my college years I thought the scariest thing about spring break was blowing too much money or missing a flight, not ending up on the wrong side of somebody else's plans. Last year proved me wrong. My best friend Jenna and I were both 22, both burned out from classes and part-time jobs, and both too broke to do the whole Panama City or Cancun thing. What we did have was a little extra cash, a long weekend, and this romantic idea of doing spring break differently in the mountains. So we booked a cheap 2-bedroom cabin outside a busy little tourist town in the Appalachians, about 15 minutes up a narrow road from the main strip of bars, restaurants, and tacky moonshine shops. The listing made it sound cozy and remote, perched on a hillside with a view of the next ridge over, keypad lock on the door, neighbors within walking distance if needed. When we got there on Thursday, the air had that cold, damp edge that sticks to you in mountain towns, and the cabin was every cliché you'd expect: knotty pine walls, a gas fireplace, and a spiral-bound guest book on the coffee table with pages of handwritten notes from couples and families about how peaceful and quiet everything was. That first afternoon, while Jenna was showering, I flipped through those entries, amused at all the hearts and inside jokes, until I hit one that made my fingers go still. Wedged between 2 long, normal entries was a short note written in cramped, hard-pressed letters that slanted like the writer's hand was shaking. If you're here for girls' weekend like we were, lock the doors. He watches the cabins from the tree line. We're not joking. K and B. There were no dates, no smiley faces to make it seem like a joke, no details. Just that. Somebody had crossed through. He watches so hard the paper had torn slightly, then rewritten it underneath. I remember staring at the words and feeling a little chill settle in my chest, then doing exactly what people my age always do when something creeps us out. I laughed it off as some edgy attempt at a scare and didn't mention it to Jenna. Instead, we dropped our bags, opened a couple of hard seltzers, and spent our first night at a low-key bar on the strip, easing ourselves into vacation mode. The next day, we wandered in and out of little shops, hiked a short overlooked trail crowded with other tourists, bought matching sweatshirts we didn't need, It was that evening, when we went back down to the strip for a real night out, that everything started rolling toward the part I still replay in my head. We ended up at a crowded place on the edge of town. The kind of bar with live country covers in one corner and craft beer flights in the other. A mix of locals and tourists smashed into a space that felt slightly too small. We were sharing a basket of fries and trying to decide if we were too old for shots when this guy walked up to our table. He had that easy kind of charm that feels practiced but still works. Nice smile, good hair, faded flannel that fit a little too well to be an accident. He said his name was Mason, and he had this soft accent that didn't quite match the heavy twang we had heard from some of the locals. He asked what brought us there, how long we were staying, all the usual small talk. It wasn't subtle that he was more focused on me than on Jenna, and it'd be lying if I said a part of me didn't enjoy the attention. He mentioned a friend of his named Tyler who was around somewhere, and before long it'd given him my number, half thinking it would be fun to have someone who knew the area show us the cool spots. We watched him walk away through the crowd, phone in hand, and I remembered Jenna making a face that was equal parts mock jealousy and appetite for drama. Later, after we'd hit another bar and then grabbed takeout to bring back to the cabin, I texted him, asking what he and his friend were doing that night. He replied almost instantly, saying they didn't have plans and suggesting the four of us meet near our cabin instead of on the strip because it would be less chaotic, more chill. He said they had their own car, could swing by to pregame. I could feel Jenna's hesitation, but the idea of sitting by the gas fireplace with music and a couple of new people sounded harmless, almost responsible compared to wandering from bar to bar. We straightened up the cabin, turned on some music, and when their old silver pickup crawled up the steep drive around 8, we were already a couple drinks in and more relaxed than we should have been. Mason and Tyler came in carrying their own bottles, polite enough at first, easy conversation, laughing at our playlists, asking about school and home. There were no red flags that screamed at me, just small things that only stand out in hindsight. The way Tyler kept subtly checking the view out the front window toward the dark tree line. The way Mason's questions about the cabin slid from normal, "How long you here?" to specific, "Anybody else renting near you? You girls both sleep upstairs, or is there a room down here?" At one point, when I went to toss some cans in the trash, I noticed that the side door leading out to the tiny back deck was unlocked, even though I was sure Id locked it when we came back from town. I chalked it up to my own distraction and turned the deadbolt, listening to the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside and thinking of that note in the guest book about someone watching from the tree line. When we finally headed back into town together, a little after 10, piling into their truck because they insisted it was easier than driving 2 cars down the narrow road, I pushed that unease down under another drink. The bar we went to was noisier and dimmer than the one from the night before. A mix of neon signs, sticky tables, and a DJ badly mixing top 40 into older rock. It didn't take long for things to get blurred at the edges. Shots appeared, bought by Mason and Tyler, and we took more than we should have. At some point, Jenna and Tyler drifted toward a quieter section by the pool tables, and I found myself at the bar with Mason, yelling small talk over the music. I remember needing to use the bathroom and him leaning toward me, asking what I wanted next. I shouted back something about a vodka soda and headed for the line of stalls, thinking about nothing more serious than whether my eyeliner was smudged. The bathroom was too bright and smelled faintly of bleach and old perfume. When I came back out and scanned the crowd for Mason, I saw him standing at the far end of the bar with 2 drinks in front of him, his body angled in a way that immediately felt wrong. He wasn't just standing there. He was hunched slightly, shoulders curled, eyes flicking quickly between the glasses and the people around him like he didn't want to be seen. His hand hovered over one of the drinks for a second, doing some small, hidden movement I couldn't quite see. For a moment I told myself he was just checking his phone or stirring with a straw, but instinct has a way of slicing through alcohol. Something in my gut went ice cold. Instead of walking straight toward him, I veered off, letting a group of people pass between us so I could change my angle. From the new vantage point, it was painfully obvious that he wasn't just scrolling his phone. His other hand, the one closest to the wall, was holding something small and white near the rim of one glass. I didn't need to see it drop to understand. My brain flashed 2 images at once. Jenna's face when Wed joked about being careful but not paranoid, and that jagged writing in the guest book about someone watching cabins. Everything inside me snapped from tipsy to sober in about 2 heartbeats. I turned around and walked straight for the exit without letting him see me, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Outside, cold air hit my face, sharp and clean. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started calling Jenna, telling myself I might be overreacting, that there could be some innocent explanation, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. She didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Texts went through, "Where are you? I think something is wrong with Mason. We need to leave." But there was no reply. That was when the first horror detail of the night landed. I got a text back from her number, finally, but the tone was off in this subtle way only someone who shared 1,000 conversations would notice. It said she was still with Tyler, that I was being dramatic, that maybe Mason had just been checking his phone by the drinks, almost word for word the excuse I'd tried to feed myself. It felt like someone had listened in on my thoughts and fed them back to me. I fired off another text saying I was heading back to the cabin and that she should meet me there, adding, almost in a panic, that I really thought Mason had tried to spike my drink. The response came too fast, too neat. "You're overthinking. Go back, he'll be there soon." No typos, no emojis, none of Jenna's usual shorthand. I tried to call again and got sent straight to voicemail. That's when I realized her battery hadn't died. Someone had probably turned her phone off between texts. The walk back to where Mason's truck had dropped us was a blur. I ordered a rideshare through the app rather than risk running into them in the parking lot, and watched the little car icon wind its way through the grid of the town. While I waited alone on the sidewalk, pressed up against the brick wall of a darkened shop, a lifted pickup rolled slowly past me. Then again, a minute later, moving barely faster than a person walking. I couldn't see the driver's face through the tinted glass, but the way it hovered at the corner for a beat longer than it should have before turning made my skin crawl. It felt like someone was measuring time, distance, options. My driver finally pulled up, a tired-looking middle-aged woman who didn't ask many questions, and I climbed in, forcing myself to make small talk about the tourist season just to hear my own voice sounding normal. As we wound up the mountain road toward the cabin, the darkness pressed in hard. No streetlights, no houses visible through the bare trees, just the occasional reflector post flashing by in the headlights. At one sharp curve, the driver had to slow almost to a stop because of something in the road. 3 stubby little stacks of stones placed dead center in our lane, each about the size of a child's toy tower. Someone had taken the time to balance rocks in a pattern that made no sense as a prank and too much sense as a marker. The driver muttered under her breath about weird kids and eased around them, but the sight wedged itself into my mind. Another piece of the night that didn't belong. By the time we pulled up in front of the cabin, my anxiety had curdled into full-blown fear. I punched in the code on the front door keypad with fingers that didn't feel like mine, slipped inside, and locked it behind me. The cabin's silence felt heavy, the kind that makes every small sound, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the heater seem too loud. I went from room to room, checking windows and the sliding door to the deck, turning deadbolts, trying not to picture the "he watches the cabins from the tree line" note in the guest book. I texted Jenna again, telling her point blank that if she wasn't already in a car on the way back, I was calling 911. No answer. Minutes passed in a slow drip. I must have dozed off sitting on the couch with the TV on low, because the next thing I remember clearly is the sound of the back door handle rattling. At first it folded into whatever half-dream I was having, a meaningless noise, until a second, more insistent jerk snapped me awake. The cabin was dark now except for the TV's glow. My phone lit up at the same time with a new text from Jenna's number. "Open the back door. Hurry. Hess coming." My mouth went dry. There were no windows facing the back deck, no peephole, no way to see who or what was on the other side of that door. I called her name out loud, voice shaking, asking her to answer me, to say something that proved it was actually her, not whoever had been replying earlier. No answer. The keypad on the back door beeped once, then again. like someone was trying codes at random and hitting the wrong combinations, punctuated by the soft, angry thump of a fist against wood. Another text came through. Please, Lauren, open the door, and my brain snagged on the fact that she never spelled my name right on the first try when she was sober, let alone drunk. I backed away from the door and dialed 911 with clumsy fingers, told the dispatcher where I was and that someone was trying to get into my rental and that I thought my friend was in trouble somewhere in town. As I talked, I moved to the front door, heart hammering, and checked the peephole, half expecting empty darkness. Instead, I saw the second horror image of the night, one that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Mason, or someone who looked like him in the bad, curved way of peephole glass, standing off to the side of the porch, just out of the direct line of the door, shoulders hunched like he'd been waiting there for a while. His head was angled toward the road, watching for something, police, maybe, or a ride share, but his body was angled toward the cabin. He held his phone in one hand, screen glowing faintly. The other hand hung loose at his side, and I could just make out the pale handle of something clipped to his belt. For a moment, I thought about what might happen if I turned off all the lights and pretended no one was home, or if I grabbed the heaviest object in the cabin and tried to stand my ground. And then the dispatcher's calm voice cut through my panic, telling me officers were already on their way up the mountain. The next few minutes stretched and collapsed in that strange way time does when you're terrified. The beeping at the back door stopped. The rattling handle went silent. I heard footsteps on the deck, then nothing. When I checked the peephole again, the front porch was empty. The silence felt worse than the noise. I think I only started breathing again when blue and red lights flickered through the trees and 2 sheriff's cars pulled into the gravel space out front. I let them in with my whole body shaking, the dispatcher still faintly audible on speaker before I ended the call. One deputy stayed with me while the other went to sweep the perimeter. A few minutes later, through the open front door, I saw another set of headlights winding up the road, slower and more careful than the cruisers. That car held Jenna. She climbed out of the back, eyes swollen from crying, hair a mess, jacket spattered with mud. She looked small in a way he'd never seen before. The deputy who had brought her up explained, in a tone that felt both practiced and furious, that a gas station clerk had called them about a young woman who seemed drunk and disoriented, wandering near the highway with no idea where her phone or her friend were. She told the officer that she'd gone outside the bar with Tyler for some air. Then things got hazy. She remembered sitting on a low wall behind the building. Something pressed into her hand, the sense of hands on her waist. Then nothing clear, until a car pulling away from a curb and the cold sting of night air somewhere she didn't recognize. While they took her statement inside the cabin, another deputy walked the back deck with his flashlight. It didn't take him long to find the third horror detail. The screen had been popped out of one of the small windows beside the back door, its frame lying crooked against the siding, and below the window sat a pair of muddy boot prints facing the glass. On the deck rail, in the dust, was the outline where something had been set down and then picked up again, leaving a clean rectangle surrounded by grime. A few minutes later, they found Jenna's phone at the very edge of the property line down the slope, half buried in wet leaves, as if someone had tossed it casually and kept walking. When they put it in a plastic bag and brought it up to show her, she touched the cracked screen like it was some dead thing. A detective arrived eventually, collected our statements, took down descriptions of Mason and Tyler and the truck. They asked about where we'd met them, what name had given me when I handed over my number, and later, when they called to follow up, they mentioned, almost casually, that the name Head used didn't match the records tied to that phone number at all. It belonged to someone else. Someone who'd reported their phone stolen weeks before. The cops said they'd pull camera footage from the bar, that they'd talk to staff, that they took this kind of thing seriously. Maybe they did. All I know is that after we packed up our things, canceled the rest of our stay, and drove out of those mountains the next morning, exhausted and wrung out, we never heard from them again. No arrest, no update, just a sickening silence where consequences should have lived. I think about that sometimes when people talk about stranger danger like it's a simple, solvable problem. The truth is, It isn't the cliché monster in the alley you have to worry about as much as the guy who looks like everyone else, who smiles the right way and asks the right questions, and tells you all the things you want to hear about how fun and carefree your weekend will be. And I think about that jagged note in the guest book, the one I decided not to show Jenna. Someone had clearly tried to warn us, or people like us, and Id skimmed right past it because we wanted our trip to be a certain kind of story. The mountains were beautiful, but for me they'll always be tied to that cabin. Those boot prints, that fake familiarity in texts that weren't from my friend at all. I still go on trips. I still sit in bars and talk to strangers sometimes, but I watch my drink like it's a living thing, and I don't ignore the little alarms in my gut anymore. If you've ever had a night out or a weekend away turn dark in that slow, creeping way, I'd honestly like to hear it. Drop your story in the comments if you're willing. It weirdly helps to know who else has seen the mask slip and walked away before someone else decided how the night was going to end.